Welcome to the seminar. Welcome to this public lecture. This is a event that is co-organized between the Asia Research Institute at the NUS and ACM, the Asian Civilization Museum. We have a kind of informal agreement between the two institutions that we will conduct public lectures 2 or 3 times a year, depending on partly the themes of the exhibition and partly the availability of our visiting fellows at the Research Institute. And the two don't always coincide. We don't always have the expertise to speak on the exhibition, and the exhibition don't always fit into who we have at hand. So sometimes they become standalone events. I'm sure most of you, since I've been in ARI for a long time and I've been going to a lot of seminars that ARI organizes and now recognize a lot of faces. I'm sure most of you know of ARI by now, but for those of you who don't, for those of you who do, just bear with me for a couple of minutes. And it's just for the benefit of those who doesn't know about ARI. The Asia Research Institute is the, at least I always proudly say this, we are the only research institute in Singapore that is not tied to the government. We are not, definitely not a think tank. We think, but not in a tank. We do not have to make reports to the government on a routine basis. And therefore we have the freedom to actually select the most interesting people every time we call for fellowship applications. We have 6 different research focus in religion, in family, in migration, cultural studies, science and technology, urbanism. And in case that's not enough, and there are some really interesting people who doesn't fit into any of those camps, we have something called open category, which means it allows us the freedom to get the interesting people without having them to do the research in the focus group area of the institute itself. At any one time at the institute, there's around 30 to about at least 30 research fellows. So it's intellectually has actually sufficient density to produce interesting work. And the institute organized somewhere around 12 to 15 workshops and conferences a year, which is a lot. So every month we have at least 1, sometimes 2. In the worst situation for the people who are organizing this event, sometimes 3. And in addition to that, we of course have weekly seminars, both by our own research fellows and intellectual people doing intellectual work passing through Singapore, and we arrange events for those. So it's a very event-heavy place. This is part, in addition to what we do in-house, we also have 2 outreach programs, one with the ACM and one with the National Library Board. So one of the complaints of being a fellow at ARI is that if you go to all the lectures, seminars and workshops, you don't get any of your own writing done. Although you will get a good education in itself. Okay, so tonight we have a distinguished speaker, Associate Professor Ching, who is currently teaching at Duke University. He is the chair of the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies. And he's one of the few people that I run a journal called Asia Culture Studies. He's one of the few people that we always run to when we have an essay in Japanese or in Chinese with Japanese references, or Japanese in Chinese references, and have to be eventually translated into English. He's one of the very few people that is fluent on all three languages, and whose academic judgment we always trust in reviewing essays for us. He's the author of the book called Becoming Japanese, Colonial Taiwan and the Politics of Identity Formation in 2001. He's currently a senior visiting fellow, research fellow at RE, and working on post-war Japanese studies. His talk tonight is Colonial Nostalgia or Post-Colonial Anxiety, Contemporary Taiwanese Perceptions of Japan.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me just say that I'm one of the fellow who actually wanted to get my own work done. I had a whole plan to finish my book manuscript while I was here, but as all the seminars and all the intellectual activities in RE is so plentiful that I find myself exactly not getting any of my work done. So I think I'm going to blame Professor Chua when I go back when I'm supposed to submit my manuscript. So it is a great honor to be here tonight in this really exquisite building. I'd like to thank the museum and the Asia Research Institute for the opportunity to speak here, and the RE staff for getting everything set up for me. It is rare for academics like me to address a general audience, so I'm both delighted and a bit anxious. Let me just begin by sort of referring to the photo that I'm using for the advertisement for the talk. This is actually a postcard from the Lin Jiafeng family collection that's housed at the Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, United States. It is a postcard of Maruyama or Yuansan Park around early 1930s. I picked this picture because it's strangely devoid of colonial presence. Because if you look at the postcard from that period, usually you get a lot of picture of colonial architecture, you know, the city hall or busy streets, right? So to showcase the bustling of business, or in Taiwan's case, usually Aborigines. But this picture, I mean, sort of stuck with me, mainly because it's a park. I mean, both the tone and the texture sort of gives this sense of serenity, or like this sort of bygone era. And also, if you look closely, there are these sort of two women sort of walking, maybe with their grandchild, seems, you know, sort of, you know, exudes this kind of a sense of maybe nostalgia or a kind of belonging that will be the topic of the talk today. Okay, so I'm going to begin. On the morning of June 7th, 2007, Li Denghui, the former president of Taiwan and self-proclaimed one-time Japanese subject, fulfilled one of his long-standing wishes and visited the Yasukuni Shrine. Li insisted that he took the pilgrimage only to mourn his late brother, who perished fighting the Japanese Navy in 1945. Li's brother, who died in the Philippines, was enshrined under his Japanese name, Iwasato Takenori. Just before going to the shrine, and amidst a barrage of media blitz, Li told reporters that this is a personal matter and asked them not to construe his visitation in any political or historical context. He added that since his father did not believe his brother was killed, they still don't have a memorial tablet at home, nor did they hold a memorial service on his brother's behalf. Li's personal journey to the controversial shrine expectedly drew the ire of the Chinese government, which had long regarded Li as promoting Taiwan independence. 3 months later, on December 17th, the Presidential Committee for the Inspection of Collaborations for Japanese Imperialism of South Korea published a report on 202 Korean collaborators between 1919 and 1937. Established in 2005 by the Special Law on the Inspection of Collaborations for Japanese Imperialism, the committee has already published 106 names for the first period between 1904 and 1919. As stated on its official website, the aim of the committee, I quote, to reveal the actual state of collaborations done in the period of Japanese imperialism in Korea to ensure historical truth and national legitimacy, and thereby to realize a just society. End of quote. The committee is entrusted with a mission to rectify the shameful history of its colonial past in preparation for the start of a new national history. And what you see here is on the top is TV stills, probably from Japan, that sort of show the committee and the reporting of confiscation of properties of the collaborators and the making of name cards for the collaborators in some of the books. And what you see at the bottom is that actually the committee has disbanded after 4.5 years and established 25 volumes of almost 21,000 pages of report on 1,005 collaborators and their activities. So I'd like to thank Hyunjun Lee for actually translating the website for me. So you see the 25 volume, and also you can get it in DVD apparently if you want. So the contrast between the two events to memories of Japanese colonialism cannot be more stark. For Lee, the visit to the shrine is a symbolic gesture to reconnect with Japanese rule and to reassert Taiwan's historical identification with Japan. For the Presidential Committee, the inspection is to purge elements of Japanese rule and its collaborators from its national history and to reclaim autonomy from the memories of colonialism. In both cases, the personal and the national intertwine, but in diametrically opposing ways. On the one hand, Lee's brother, or more precisely, his spirit, as a former colonial subject, resurrects as a mediating force that rekindles both familial and colonial relations. This reconfirms Lee's and Taiwan's historical and emotional connectivity to Japan. On the other hand, the 1,005 traders or collaborators, with their individual names and crimes publicly displayed, and some of their properties and assets posthumously confiscated, demonstrate the resolve of the state to punish those who conspired with the Japanese and to insist on a radical break from Korea's shameful history. Setting aside the important differences between Korea and Taiwan for another occasion, I'm interested tonight in exploring the sentiment of nostalgia and intimacy toward Japan and the Japanese as displayed by former colonial subjects such as Lee and his generation of what has been called Japanese-speaking tribe, or Nihongozoku, or what the Japanese writer Shiba Ryotaro has affectionately referred to as Old Taipei's, Lao Taipei. What I want to suggest is that the favorable and at times intense feelings toward Japan must be understood on two levels. First, as a desire to recuperate a sense of loss in both personal and historical terms. With many of these men and women in their late 70s and early 80s, and as the last generation of Taiwanese who has significant contact with Japanese rule, they fear that their impending death will also mean the end of the historical linkage between Japan and Taiwan. I understand their passion as a belated plea for the recognition from the former colonizers of their marginalized existence since the end of formal colonialism. Second, from a regional perspective, their sense of loss is exasperated by the real and perceived decline of Japan and the rise of China. Their anxiety points to a larger historical shift in the region. The modern colonial and post-war Cold War systems in Asia characterized by the dominance of Japan, appears to have ended. Their desire for reconnection and anxiety for Japan's regeneration only confirm the inevitable reconfiguration of power in East Asia. Moreover, along with issues of so-called comfort women, war responsibilities, and more recently, territorial disputes, they represent a strand of unresolved legacies of Japanese empire that are part of a larger process of East Asian modernity that have yet to be properly addressed and remain contested. So on a number of occasions when I speak about this topic, usually people afterwards will come up to me and say, oh, you know, that really reminds me of my parents or, you know, my grandparents. And just recently, actually, a graduate student from Seattle who was at RE attending one of those many conferences actually emailed me and came to see me because after seeing the description of the talk, she was like, wow, you know, that's just exactly like my father. On the other hand, I have this American anthropologist who told me that after years of working in Taiwan, he has never met anybody who considered themselves pro-Japanese. I told him that he's probably interviewing the wrong people, or he's wrong sides. But anyway, regardless, I mean, the point is that, you know, these are obviously real human beings. However, I also want to suggest that they also constitute a kind of social and cultural identity that represents a particular mood or sentiment that is specific to a generation of Taiwanese people. And one thing why I'm so interested in this particular generation is that I feel in cultural studies, we talk about race, gender, class, and so on and so forth. We haven't, it seems to me, paid enough attention to generation or intragenerational differences. So this is sort of one attempt of trying to intervene in that respect. So unlike the young consumers of the so-called Japan fever tribe, or Harinzu, in contemporary Taiwan, whose identification with Japan is exclusively driven by consumption and popular culture, the older generation's relation to Japan is mediated through recollection of belonging, social order, and feelings of loss. As mentioned earlier, there are a couple ways to refer to this generation of pro-Japanese Taiwanese: the Japanese-speaking tribe, Nihongo-zuku, or 日本语族, or Old Taipei, 老台北. However, I would like to use the Taiwanese term Doan to describe them. For me, Nihongo-zoku and Lao Taipei is sort of coming from the Japanese perspective, when I wanted to find a term that is sort of native, or that's at least nativized, right? So I'm borrowing this term Doan. The word Doan derives from the Japanese Tosan, meaning father. Doan has enjoyed some currency in post-colonial Taiwan among the Minnan-speaking families and conveys an amicable, respectful, if not tragic, sentiment. The slippage from the original To sound with the sort of T sound to the Taiwanese Do sound, the D sound, points not only to the traces of colonialism, but also the process of indigenization and appropriation. In 1994, Wu Nianzhen's Do sound, as you see the poster on the right, a film based on Wu's father's life living through Japanese and nationalist rules, gained critical acclaim and brought the term to popular and public consciousness. Doan therefore refers to the generation of men who spent their formative years under Japanese rule and traumatized by the ensuing recolonization by the Nationalist or Kuomintang KMT regime. For years, living in relative quietude under the KMT's anti-Japan policy and authoritarianism, the Doan generation only began to publicly express their thoughts in recent years. And I call them the kind of silent generation because, first of all, Japanese was banned, so they couldn't speak, literally, right? I mean, there is the Minnan, of course, on the other hand, but the fact that they also lost any of their cultural capital, because their existence during the Japanese period, I mean, everything was been basically denied or rendered, as I will talk about a little bit later, rendered a kind of a slave mentality, right? So, and the kind of intergenerational conflict is also rendered very clearly. I mean, you see the film where his children, who were basically educated under a Chinese Mandarin education, were sort of mock him, right? When he scolds them, or they will talk back in Mandarin Chinese to him. It's because he doesn't understand what they're saying. As depicted in the film, Doan exudes a sense of masculine dignity, sadness, and loneliness from the alienation he suffers under the new regime and the longing for Japan that is no longer in his borrowed life. In the film, actually, Dosan's dream is to one day be able to go to Japan and visit the Imperial Palace and Mount Fuji. You know? And of course, he never makes it at the end of the film, and then his son actually bring his actual tablet and, on his behalf. Largely because of their explicit pro-Japanese sentiment and their seemingly anachronistic existence in contemporary Taiwan, the Doan generation has found sympathetic ears among the Japanese neoconservatives. More often than not, they are being propped up as simply confirming the conservative and nationalist agenda. The complicated and contradictory emotions and sentiments that caused by the historical shift from colonial to post-colonial conditions and Japan's responsibilities toward these former subjects are rarely mentioned or interrogated by these very neoconservatives. Their identity is again being assimilated into a Japaneseness that they cannot possess but can only lament at its alleged passing, much like their own tumultuous lives. So for example, one of the more renowned Japanese neoconservatives, Kobayashi Yoshinori, in his the last page of his controversial comic Taiwan or on Taiwan. I mean, so you have Kobayashi basically sort of, I mean, he looks much worse than what he actually presents himself, but sort of reflecting on all the sort of Taiwanese from the older generation, the Doan generation, and some of the young ones. Right? I mean, part of the desire of Japanese neoconservatives for Taiwan is the emergence of Taiwanese nationalism, right? Because the Japanese conservatives feel that because nationalism is no longer pivotal among the young people in Japan, right? So they cease sort of, it projects its own anxiety over this lack of declining of national vigor onto the emerging Taiwanese nationalism. So he actually, at the end, he talks about how it is the Taiwanese intellectuals and their future descendants that will be able to objectively evaluate modern Japanese history, meaning to have a better view of Japan. So as I would like to argue later on, despite similar rhetoric of intimacy and attachment, the Doan generation and Japanese neoconservatives do not share the same aspiration. An appropriate way to describe their differences is the Chinese saying, 同床异梦, meaning sleeping in the same bed but have different dreams. Right? So I want to suggest that despite the fact that on the form or on the surface, it looks like the conservatives and the Doan generation actually cohere in their sentiment, but they're actually thinking about different things. The complicity between Taiwanese and Japanese neoconservatives is neither new nor surprising. As Mori Yoshiharu in a 2001 book has argued, several former advocates of Taiwan independence residing in Japan, such as Huang Wenxiong and Jing Meilin, have switched from their earlier critique of Japanese rule to become the spokespersons for the Japanese neoconservative agenda. This turnabout, Mori suggests, is largely due to the political democratization of Taiwan since the 1990s, which increasingly diminished the relevance of the pro-independence advocates living in Japan. In other words, since Taiwan itself is democratizing, so all the sort of sort of independence, people living outside of Taiwan become less and less relevant. The conservative turn was caused by a number of political failures and their own sense of irrelevance, not to mention the effort to rationalize their struggle and existence. The desire to be heard hence pushed them toward a mutual utilitarianism with Japanese neoconservatives. More importantly and instructive here is Mori's indictment of post-war Japanese leftists' indifference to the voices of the formerly colonized. And leftist intellectuals, Mori argues, in their post-war political correctness, have bought into the pro-Japan Taiwan and anti-Japan Korea-China binary structure of the Cold War. Since Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek's rule was ostensibly a client state of the United States, it automatically meant all voices from Taiwan are anti-communist and hence non-progressive. Modi points out that this radicalism actually concealed the arrogance of the former colonizer in his refusal to actually confront Japan's own colonial history. The inattentiveness and marginalization of Taiwan by the Japanese left ironically obscured the colonial connection between Japan and Taiwan in the post-war years. And this is actually quite symptomatic because recently there's actually a surge of interest in Takeuchi Yoshimi, one of the very sort of important post-war Japanese leftist sort of literature, culture critic. And if you read his writing, because he often talks about modernity, Asia, and so on and so forth, he never writes about Taiwan. It's all about Chinese literature, China. Right? So this is sort of symptomatic of what Modi was arguing, that the left, despite their very radical politics, completely ignores the history of colonialism. And that's the pitfall of the Japanese left. So let me sort of introduce two concepts crucial to the understanding of post-war Taiwan society before moving on, since I'm not assuming that everyone here is familiar with Taiwan. The two concepts I want to introduce really sort of defies translation, so I'm just going to use the Chinese 本省人 and 外省人. So these are categories that describe two opposing sets of identities in post-war Taiwan. Literally, 本省人 means people from the Taiwan province, and 外省人 meaning people who from outside of the province. And the crucial demarcating years is between 1947 and 1949. As many of you know, the nationalist government, after losing its a civil war to the communists, fled to Taiwan, right? And those are the sort of pivotal years that differentiate those people who were in Taiwan before then will be considered 本省人, and then those who came after will be 外省人. So even like me, I was actually born in Taiwan, but because my father was 外省人, so I'm, 外省人, even though my mother is actually 本省人, right? So you follow the. But it's more than just sort of a question of identities. And these are what I will argue is they're imagined identities that have meaning only in relation to each other. Sort of like black and white, men and women, right? I mean, you cannot just talk about one without the other. And they are imagined in the sense that because even within Taiwan, even within 本省人, there's a huge diversity, right? There's really not a common culture or common language to speak of. I mean, not to mention those who came from mainland China, the 外省人, right? Obviously, China is so large and there's this. But regardless, it congeals into a kind of Minnan Taiwanese language versus Mandarin Chinese as a kind of language difference. And in terms of sports, for example, you always argue that 本省人 plays baseball, whereas 外省人 plays basketball, right? Influence from the U.S. versus influence from the Japanese, right? Because Japanese brought baseball to Taiwan during the colonial period. And I argue that these are not just simply free-floating identities, but a structure. I mean, they're locked into each other, a kind of structure of antagonism that is specific to post-war, post-colonial context of Taiwan. In other words, these terms will make no sense elsewhere, right? They only make sense within Taiwan, and still, very much so, right? I mean, it's sort of diluting a little bit recently, but. So before looking into the writing by the Doan generation, so let me place their writing in a larger context of writing on Japan and Japanese in post-war Taiwan, or what I call Nihon Jinno in Taiwan. So what I'm trying to do is I'll give you a larger context in which writings about Japan or about the Japanese in post-war Taiwan. And so give you a sense that where the kind of writing I'm going to deal with emerged from. So according to the study by Huang Zihui, between 1947 and 2000, approximately 40 books on Japan and the Japanese were published in the Chinese language, with the majority coming in only after 1987. I mean, this number might shock you, it seems rather small, right? But then we have to remember, like in the post-war years, I mean, it's not till after 1987 after democratization, after the end of martial law, that people can actually actively write sort of what they want to write, right? So approximately 40 books on Japan and the Japanese were published in the Chinese language, with the majority coming only after 1987. In the immediate post-war years, as to be expected, books on Japan were mostly written by Weissermen, the mainlanders, from the perspective of a victor's nation. Even if they were written by Bensermen, by the Taiwanese, they were published only with the tacit approval of the Weissermen ruling party, reflecting the political view of the KMT. So it's, okay. So sentiments about personal relations between the former colonized and the colonizer and the colonized are subsumed and silenced under the binary between the victor and loser nations, between the heroic patriots and the evil imperialists. In short, during this period, Chinese language writing on Japan reflected Weissermen perspective of the invaded peoples as opposed to colonized peoples. I mean, so what I'm trying to argue is that the writing about Japan in immediate post-war years in the Chinese language reflected, on the one hand, the Weissermen perspective, but more importantly, it reflected the perspective of the invaded peoples, right? Which is meaning that it's the perspective of mainland China, because mainland China is being invaded, right? So it's not the perspective of the colonized. So I try to make the subtle differentiation between those who were invaded and those who were colonized. And I'll argue that difference is actually crucial. The subtle but unmistaken distinction between the invaded peoples and the colonized peoples is important, for it not only marginalized the experience and perspective of the Taiwanese, it also rendered colonialism invisible in the post-war nationalist discourse. As we will see later, this distinction has dire consequences for the Taiwanese after the end of formal colonialism. In the post-martial law era, after 1987, writing about Japan from the perspective of the formerly colonized flourished, especially since the 1990s. 24 Taiwanese Nihonjinron books were published between 1992 and 2003. These works are mostly written in Japanese by Bensermen and are either self-published or published in Japan. Most of these were penned by non-professional writers and employed literary forms such as memoirs, autobiography, and poetry. Unlike those written in Chinese by Weissermen, or from a Weissermen perspective, these works recollect and re-examine with immense emotion their personal experiences, ranging from strong condemnation of Japanese rule to the equally passionate affirmation of Japanese colonialism. The shift from the perspective of the invaded to that of the colonized, propelled by the democratic movement in Taiwan since the 1990s, opened up a new space for a more Taiwan-centric understanding of its own history, especially the colonial period. And this is where the text I'll be analyzing falls in. So I have chosen for an analysis 4 recent works that follow the Taiwanese colonized viewpoint that express profound nostalgia and fondness for Japanese colonialism. The choice is not entirely arbitrary. They are published in Japanese under a book series entitled Pride of the Japanese by Sakura no Hana Publishing House, a publisher that harbors an obvious, as you will see by the website, obvious neoconservative and neo-nationalist agenda. The series title, Pride of the Japanese, invites a double reading of Japanese. Those former subjects who are proud of their once being Japanese, and Japanese today who are being called forth to be proud of their country. The series has recently expanded beyond Taiwan to include testimonies and memoirs from Sri Lanka, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So for example, the Indonesia one basically argued that the Great East Asian War is not a war of invasion. And all the testimonies by Indonesians supposedly testify to that. And the middle one, basically the title is Thanks to Japan, Asia is today thanks to Japan. And so try to reveal the truth of how Japanese rule have actually made Asia prosper. And the last one on the right is based on a memoir from a Filipino boy who apparently had spent some time with the kamikaze pilot at some point and sort of reflecting very fondly of his experience with the Japanese suicide pilot. So, anyways. So the series Pride of the Japanese has published 4 books from Taiwan since 2003. And these are some of the books I'll be looking at today. The Japanese Were Wonderful, so I'm just going to go, so the Japanese Were Wonderful by Yang Su-Cho. The Unreturned Japanese, and I'm not going to go to the names, I'm just going to quickly mention the books, the title. Motherland is Japan, Fatherland is Taiwan, and Wonderful Japanese Teachers and Its Education. And as you can tell by the cover, it has this really dizzying sort of like, cherry blossom, flood, sort of storm kind of feel to it. And the pastel color, really render a kind of softness, right? I mean, to the cover. With Yang Su-Cho as the sole woman, they all fit the profile of what I call the Doan generation. They were mostly born in the 1920s and 1930s. And spent their formative years during a period of intense assimilation and war mobilization. They encountered the end of war in their youth with a strong sense of confusion and depletion. They also lived through the rule of the nationalist regime. When these books were published, the authors are already in their 70s and 80s. Although each of these texts is written from an individual perspective with different experiences, writing by the Doan generation share a common narrative structure and rhetoric strategy that we might call the nostalgic mode. The notion of nostalgia, I want to suggest, is not about some real past, but a constructed or imaginary past that in most instances is recalled to alleviate anxieties of the present. Simply put, unlike conventional understanding of nostalgia of fond memories, the feeling of nostalgia tells us more about the present than some imagined notion of the past. The conservative in the United States, for example, often knowingly evoked the late 1950s as representing the good old days when America was powerful and socially stable. They often cite shows like Leave It to Beaver as representing the ideal family that no longer exists in America today. Needless to say, the kind of family represented in Leave It to Beaver, this kind of suburban middle class, white America, a clear gender division, the mother's always home, the father's always worked, never existed in mainstream America in the 1950s, where blacks were segregated and women still couldn't vote. It is an imagined ideal that tries to symbolically lessen the anxiety over present predicament. So what I'm basically saying is that nostalgia is not about the past at all. In fact, nostalgia has more to do with the present than anything of the past. And whatever that we reflect fondly in the past is always a kind of reconstructed one, right? That it really didn't exist. So one can call this a kind of nostalgia for the present, if you want. The nostalgic mode calls upon us to view post-coloniality in a particular order that corresponds to the lives of the Doan generation. The text will usually begin with the author reflecting on an individual or a group of Japanese whom he or she either owed gratitude to or shared fond memories with. They often evoked the peaceful and stable time characterized by the presence of kind and gentle policemen and soldiers and wonderful teachers. Teachers and policemen are crucial in thinking about colonial rule in Taiwan, mainly because these are authority figures that most common people actually do come in contact with. And later on, soldiers are evoked as this kind of wonderful soldier who are fighting for on behalf and so on and so forth. And you actually often come across a lot of stories, actually, about teachers, about sacrificing, for the teachers, about policemen, especially around the Aborigine territory. And they often, intermarriage is a frequent occurrence in which the Japanese policemen were married to the tribal leader's daughter, and often divorced, and so on and so forth. But anyways. It then goes on to recount. Okay, so It then goes on to recount the numerous achievements of modernization that Japanese rule has accomplished in Taiwan, such as education, infrastructure building, medicine, law and order, and etc. The benefit of Japanese colonialism is then followed and juxtaposed by the ruthless authoritarian rule of the KMT, usually highlighting the infamous February 28 incident and the White Terror era of the 1950s. The books will generally end with the authors concerned over the degeneration of Japanese nation today and his or her plea for the Japanese to remember the historical connection between Japan and Taiwan and to be proud of their nation. The titles of the books connote the sense of nostalgia, a lament and fondness for a constructed past. Suteki datta, right, was beautiful. Subarashikatta, was wonderful. The authors often play the role of former Japanese subjects, much like adopted children who were left behind with Japan's defeat and repatriation. They are witness to the greatness and benevolence of Japanese colonialism, opinions and convictions that have been refuted and repressed in Japan since 1945. Their functions are thus liminal and surrogate, both inside and outside of Japan, as indicated by the titles The Unreturned Japanese, Motherland is Japan, Fatherland is Taiwan. As former Japanese, they can speak for the conscience of Japan that has been silenced in the post-war era. This notion of a repressed history, of what the conservatives would call Japan's masochist view of history, has become the battle cry of Japanese conservatives in their allegation that post-war American censorship and Japanese leftist apologies have rendered true history of modern Japan invisible to the Japanese people. All the writers, when reflecting on what they miss most about the colonial period, unanimously point to the loss of the Japanese spirit, not only in post-war, post-colonial Taiwan, but in contemporary Japan as well. Kobayashi Yoshinori, the manga artist that I showed you earlier on, the neoconservative manga artist, claims that the Japanese spirit, lost and forgotten in Japan, can only be found in Taiwan. It is important, however, to understand the notion of Japanese spirit for the Taiwanese is different from the amorphous idea of a Japanese national essence associated with wartime mobilization and the imperial system. This is what I was referring earlier by sleeping in the same bed but different dreams. The Taiwanese reading of Japanese spirit, the right, is a decidedly post-war and post-colonial expression. That the Taiwanese usually use the Taiwanese pronunciation, rather than the Japanese Nihon Seishin, only underscored the colonial difference. Unlike Nihon Seishin, that projects a sense of dedication and commitment to the Japanese nation and the emperor, Nihon Jinshin defines a quotidian and practical understanding of social etiquette and communal conduct that is associated with modernity. It is construed less about the nation, but everyday lives and their organization. Most Japanese neoconservatives, eager to recuperate an imaginary ideal, often project their own notions of Nihon Seishin onto the Taiwanese Nippon Jinshin. The Taiwanese pronunciation points to attitudes and behaviors that suggest moral and ethical virtues. It points to a wide spectrum of conducts and behaviors that is associated with the greater good: punctuality, justice, diligence, lawfulness, responsibility, sincerity, humaneness. So to put it crudely, whereas the Japanese demanded patriotism and emperor worship, the Taiwanese liked it only because the train were running on time. It is important to note here that these attitudes are associated with, not with Japan per se, but with the perceived Japanese period, and always in contrast with the nationalist government from the mainland. This bears repeating. The fondness for the Japanese period is always uttered in contradistinction from post-war nationalist rule. It is only through the historical trauma of another post-colonial colonial rule that the Japanese colonial period appears to be righteous, just, and orderly. Thus the nostalgia for the colonial period is projected to underscore the rampant corruption of the Chinese and the authoritarian regime of the KMT. It is by associating 理本精行 as a modern moral and ethical conduct for the greater good, a philosophy of the public, if you will, that the former colonized also laments its passing in contemporary Japan, where they see rampant social ills that they attribute to the increasing self-centered populace who have abandoned the notion of the common good. So I'm basically arguing that the whole idea of the Japanese spirit has to be understood differentially, right? So what the Japanese imagine as Japanese, spirit is not what the Taiwanese usually think of when they evoke the term. So this is what I would argue is the colonial difference. 理本精行 underpins the imagined period that critiques the post-colonial era and further emphasizes the difference and incommensurability between China and Taiwan. The contrast between Japanese rule and Chinese rule is usually posited between modern and primitive, which overturns the normative relationship between mainlanders and Taiwanese. The writers uniformly comment on the images of the takeover Chinese soldiers as ill-equipped, haggard, and beggar-like in their appearance, and lacking military discipline. Their crassness and idiocy are documented and repeated in absurd follies about their incapability to understand or use modern technology. So for example, there are all these rumors that Chinese soldiers, they come to Taiwan, they go shopping, they buy a light bulb, right? They screw on the light bulb and they get pissed off because the light wouldn't turn on because they forget or they don't know how to turn on the switch. Or another sort of rumor is that another Chinese soldier comes to Taiwan, get pissed off at the shop clerk because he bought a faucet and then he stuck it to the wall and tried to turn it on but water would not come out. So it is not important to me that whether these incidents really happen or not, but the fact that they become this kind of rumors that indicates the uncivility of the takeover military from China only underscore their conviction that Japan lost to America and not to the Chinese. The stories of the boorish and uncivilized soldiers reversed the dominant discourse of restoration that justified the KMT rule over Taiwan. In Taiwan, decolonization, unlike the normative Third World discourse, was not the striving for independence. In the Third World sort of notion, we talk about independence or 独立, right? In Taiwan, or in mainland China, for example, the communist rule is seen as emancipation, right? Emancipating, liberating the people from bourgeois national rule. In Taiwan, decolonization is rendered restoration, 光复, meaning restoring back to mainland. As the KMT maintained its symbolic legitimacy over the representation of China, restoration of Taiwan meant Sinicization or 中国化 of the Taiwanese from their 50-year of enslavement or 奴化 by the Japanese. It is important here to note the subtle but crucial difference in which Koreans and Chinese discourse constructed its internal other, the collaborators, with the Japanese, and the Chinese representation of the Taiwanese subject. In Korean discourse that we saw earlier in the slide, the collaborators are considered, pardon my bad Korean, Ching, right? Sort of pro-Japanese faction. In Chinese, the collaborators are often called Hanjian, or traitors to the Han race, right? But what is interesting is that, but for the Taiwanese, right, because they were enslaved, 奴化, so Taiwanese actually become slaves. So what is interesting here is that by attributing the colonial period as a period of enslavement, the KMT, or the national government, not only legitimized itself as a superior culture, but also availed itself unconditional power to de-slave its subjects and to expel any remnant of colonial rule in total and by any means necessary. Whereas Qing or Hanjian must be tried, right, the collaborators, they must be tried, exhibited, and executed to some extent. The slaves, by definition of another ownership, are not only freed by the nationalists, they also must be re-educated and its culture reconfigured. And this, I think, is the crucial difference. In other words, the entire collectivity of the Taiwanese, under the notion of enslavement by the Japanese, they need to be enslaved themselves. And enslaving only meant through sinicization, which to become Chinese, or become more Chinese than Chinese. Right? Whereas collaborators or Hanjian could be expelled. Right? And that's where the legitimacy and overturns the kind of, that the nationalist government can actually see itself as superior because it freed the slaves. So enslavement, therefore, led to the necessity for eradication of everything that links to Japanese colonialism. Meaning anything that can be associated with Japanese rule, from language to education, from clothing to architecture, and so on and so forth. So during this time of so-called transition, Taiwanese intellectuals pleaded for a more moderate process of translation. In other words, for the Taiwanese intellectuals, they realize that Japan is still a much more modernized nation. And there's benefit to Japanese education or Japanese rule. So instead of completely doing away with Japanese and education or Japanese language, they asked for a much more moderate sort of process in which translation, meaning translating Japanese text into Chinese, allowing Japanese language to coexist for a period of time with Chinese or Mingan as a way for sort of decolonization. However, this gesture was completely rejected in favor of a top-down process of sinicization, or 中国化. So Taiwanese intellectuals were therefore deprived of its role as active subjects of decolonization. Instead, they became passive objects of sinicization. The primitivity of the victorious army is further compounded by the rampant corruption and brutality of the new regime. All the writers mentioned the February 28 incident in 1947 when native discontent and frustration over corruption, social disorder, military abuse, and economic hardship exploded to an island-wide protest against the nationalist regime. This led to a severe military crackdown where tens and thousands of Taiwanese were killed and arrested. Restoration is followed by a period of white terror aimed at squashing political dissent and exercising ideological control in the name of anti-communism under the Cold War structure. The KMT, or the nationalist government, launched several anti-Japanese measures to consolidate its rule and to re-educate the Taiwanese. From this perspective, the longing for the bunjingxing and the Japanese period, or this sense of nostalgia, unlike most theories on nostalgia, is not simply a passive and conservative reaction of status quo, or lamenting the passing away of a particular privilege. Instead, it is an active demand for reparation and redress. The nostalgia for Nipun Jinxing as a counter-narrative to their second colonization under the nationalist regime thus forms an anti-Chinaism in the Doan generation that is both culturalist and racist. Their post-liberation experiences consolidated in their minds that the Chinese are prone to lying and untrustworthy, deceptive, and inherently corrupt. From one's own Waisan brother-in-law to generalized remarks about rude and shoplifting Chinese tourists, all Waisan and mainlanders are conflated, stereotyped, if not demonized, as insidious, corrupt, and egotistic. Not only are the Japanese period then rationalized as better and just, but any criticism of Japanese colonialism is regarded as a Chinese conspiracy. In their resolute anti-Chinaism, the Doan generation envisions themselves in their twilight years as humble elders, reminding a degenerating nation, Japan, of its past grandeur and accomplishment in the midst of the rise of China. The ambiguity and double meaning of the Bunjingxing and Nihonseixing, in a weird way, reconnects the former colonized's plea for recognition and the former colonizer's desire for national revival. This shared ethos emerges as a mechanism to imagine a future that was denied to the former colonial subjects. So the Doan generation take pain to explain that their opinions about contemporary Japan should not be construed as criticism, but as kind advice from those who were once Japanese. Many lament their old age, but hope to awaken and revitalize Japan through their feeble but genuine acts. They urge the Japanese to develop historical consciousness about Japan's colonial relationship to Taiwan, to rekindle the pride the Japanese once had during the colonial period and post-war reconstruction, and also to remember the once beautiful and wonderful nation. What is clear from this desire for reconnection between Japan and Taiwan and Japan's revival is their acute sense of threat from the rise of China. All the texts present emergence of China as a danger to the coast prosperity of the nation. They still view the new China through lens of old stereotypes and are unable to reconcile the gap between their seeing the astonishing economic growth and their believing in their memories of underdeveloped China. What this anxiety reveals is precisely the passing of Japan as the sole leader in the region. With the economic and cultural development of South Korea, Taiwan, and the so-called Greater China, Japan, for the first time in its modern history, has to confront its neighbors as equals. The anxiety over the eclipsing of the Japan-centric model is crucial to the neoconservatives' attempt at recuperating its pride of the Japanese. For the Doan generation, it is also an attempt at making a sense of their tumultuous lives under various periods of colonization. It is a desperate yearning for recognition, a truncated identity that with their passing will be forgotten and buried with their remains. Abandoned by Japanese colonialism after Japan's defeat, oppressed by the KMT because of their Japanese heritage, they found no viable channels to express their feelings, emotions, and longings other than in the privacy of their homes with their families and friends. That the Japanese neoconservatives became the only group who will mobilize their memories and stories is only a testament to the tenacity of the traces of colonialism and the bitter sweetness of the post-colonial condition between Japan and Taiwan. The rise of anti-China sentiment is not limited to Japan neoconservatives and the Doan generation. Rather, it is becoming a worldwide phenomenon. In the US, for example, an advertisement by the Citizen Against Government Waste has caused some controversy recently. Heralded by some as depicting economic reality and chastised by others as being xenophobic, if not outright racist. I just want to play this because I think it's kind of interesting to look at the recent anti-Chinese.
为什么强大的国家都会走向灭亡呢？古希腊、罗马、不列颠帝国、美国，因为他们都犯同样错误，与原来使得他们成功的原则背道而驰。美国政府企图以庞大的开支和税收来摆脱严重的经济衰退，巨额的所谓刺激开支、庞大的医疗改革、政府接管私有企业、债务累累。当然，我们是他们的大债主。现在都得给我们干。
You can change the future. You have to. Join Citizens Against Government Waste to stop the spending that is bankrupting America.
This is the same people who did this post 9/11 George Bush sort of really feeling bad. But it's actually quite interesting because it's been discussed quite a lot by both mainstream press, but also on the web. And James Fallows, one of the sort of renowned critic, actually, praised this ad as sobering for Americans. And a lot of Asian Americans, of course, see this as outright racist, meaning that this again the kind of red peril, the reenactment of the Asian takeover, right? And part of I think the allure of this short clip is set in the near future, but not distant future, right? 2030, only 20 years from now, right? One generation, it could happen. Right, and the end with all these, I think those are all Asian Americans. This was shot in Virginia somewhere, and then these were all students from. But anyways, but I mean, one thing I think it's interesting to compare the European, if not American, anti-China sentiment and some of the more recent Japanese ones. And the Japanese one that I sort of looked at were mostly these are all, by the way, comic books. These are all manga. And a lot of them, it's interesting because they do actually interrogate some of the contradiction of China's so-called capitalism and socialist characteristics, such as the large gap between rich and poor, environmental degradation, and so on and so forth. But the problem is that they end up always taking on the nationalist stance, right? So the critique, which is actually not wrong, but gets reabsorbed into this, well, so therefore Japan was so much better, right? So therefore the rights of China is overstated and so on and so forth. And this one, which I actually wrote about in a different context, actually sort of argues that Chinese civilization is basically a civilization of cannibalism and rampant with prostitution. Right, so basically, cannibals and prostitutes are the two major characteristics of China. So this is, so part of I think the difference, if you want to, we can maybe talk about this later on. But the difference between sort of Euro-American anti-Chinaism has this sense of this fear of the decline of the empire, whereas the Japanese tend to much more sort of try to expose the Chinese civilization. Right, rather than the sense of our decline, even though obviously it's sort of affected by the sense of Japan's decline. And of course, more recently, the protests against the release of the captain, the ship captain, back to China. And what is interesting, I actually have not seen this kind of image very often in Japan. And this is actually quite new, that young people, if not children, are mobilized in this kind of march. And usually you see a lot of angry men, in this kind of protest. But okay, finally. I'm not sure what I'm concluding, but anyways, I'm going to say something to finish. The Martinique-born psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary Frantz Fanon has said that decolonization is always a violent phenomenon. It is quite simply the replacing of a certain species of man by another species of man. Without any period of transition, he argues, there is a total, complete, and absolute substitution. It is a historical process where the last shall be first and the first last. This reversal of fortune can take place, he warns us, only after a murderous and decisive struggle between the two protagonists. The decolonization process between Japan and Taiwan was violent, but the violence ensued was not between the colonizer and the colonized, but between the restoring semi-colonized Chinese and the Japan-colonized Taiwanese. Whereas Fanon has cautioned about reproducing the structure of the colonizer under the national bourgeoisie after liberation and the implication of neo-colonialism, decolonization in Taiwan and Japan produced two different but interrelated trajectories, a process of what I call recolonization through restoration and decolonization through defeat. In Taiwan, restoration, guangfu, became another form of exerting external control over the natives, inheriting the colonial structure left behind by the former colonizer. In this post-colonial condition, the last remained last. Japan's war defeat meant that the Japanese Empire was automatically liquidated without intense struggles in the former colonies. War defeat simply replaced decolonization. The first did not become last. Modern Japan has always had an ambivalent relationship to its Asian neighbors. It has viewed itself as simultaneously both part of Japan and part of Asia and apart from Asia, racially similar but culturally superior. This modern colonial perspective is fast becoming outdated, given the rise of China and other Asian countries such as South Korea and Taiwan. As mentioned earlier, Japan, for the first time in its modern history, must confront its neighbors as equals. Or maybe I should instead of must confront, must relate, so it's more passive. Orphan of Asia by Wu Zhuoliu is perhaps one of the most representative literary work from colonial Taiwan that encapsulated the collective sentiment of the Taiwanese people. Written during the waning years of World War II, the novel describes the painful realization of a Taiwanese identity after being rejected by both Japanese colonialism and Chinese nationalism. It is interesting that Kan Sang-ju, the resident Korean critic, has recently asked if the Japanese are willing to be the orphan of Asia if it continues to serve as a client state of the United States and ignore better relations with its Asian neighbors. What can the old orphan teach the new orphan of Asia? For the Doan generation, the desire for recognition derives from the ambivalence of their colonial and post-colonial identities. Ke De-san, one of the Doan generation, writes that during colonial period, when he visited Japan, he was asked by the Japanese, where is he from? When he told them he's from Taiwan, he's asked if he's related to the headhunting Aborigines. In post-colonial times, when he visits Japan, the question is still, where are you from? And when he answers, I'm from Taiwan, where are you from? And when he answers, I'm from Taiwan, then he's asked, then why do you speak Japanese so fluently? Post-war and post-colonial Japanese simply cannot imagine the existence of people who were once Japanese and the messy legacies of its empire. This inability to relate to the former colonial subject is symptomatic of the larger forgetting of colonialism in post-war Japan. Nostalgia may be the only avenue for the Doan generation to gain a sympathetic audience. For the Doan generation, unfortunately, time may not be on their side. Thank you.